Welcome to the Future Sickos podcast with your hosts, Brennan Detzler and Derek Lee.
What is up? Welcome to Future Sickos, episode 33, we'll say, for good measure, maybe some in between. Today we are kicking off our season preview with no other than, kind of the king of YouTube in regards to hockey videos, Nathan Grav Murdoch. So Nathan, I think one of the first things we want to get out of you is how the nickname Grav came to be, because I thought it was going to be related to your last name, but realizing now that it's Murdoch, I don't really see where that derives from.
Well, yeah. First things first. Thank you guys for having me. It's a blessing to be a part of this, and it's probably the funniest story I could ever tell, and it's not a long one, so that's a good thing too. But I think 6 years ago when I was starting the channel, I remember it was actually a really funny story because I was first allowed to get an email account. So I'm like, okay, I'll start a YouTube channel on top of this. And literally the only story I have is that I just like the word gravity. So I just changed up the last two letters to make it a little bit more different. Cause I'm like, oh, there's like 15,000 other YouTubers just with the name Gravity. So to make myself different, to make myself feel special, I'll just make a EH at the end. And it's funny because some people have asked, some people have asked if it's like a French thing or something. Like I know like Habs fans have asked me, like, is that like because you're from Quebec or something? And I'm like, no, it's just, I want to be different. And
that's hilarious because it's like, everyone has that like first email address that they kind of distantly were like, oh yeah, like mine was like Sweet Mole 77. Did not tell you the reasoning for it, but it's hilarious because it's like, everyone has that like literal, like, back in the day, but it's like it's actually like your identity now. Like it's like you weren't able to just kind of like leave it back with like MSN. Now it's followed you all the way through. So that is a pretty awesome story. So you started YouTubing at what age? Like at what point did all of this begin?
So I started uploading March of 2017. So I turned 14 the month before. So
you're still very young then.
Yeah. So I'm turning 20 in February, which for me feels old, but I know like whenever I mentioned it to Steve that I was Steve Dangle when I think I was 4 or 5 when he started doing Leafs fan reactions. And when he first heard that, like he couldn't believe it, but that's actually how it goes. So, I was 14 when I started, and it was one of those things where I remember watching a bunch of YouTube growing up and really maybe not wanting that to be like my full-time thing, but wanted to try it out and wanted to do something special. And then I started watching a bunch of baseball YouTubers, and then I started doing that a little bit, but then I started getting more into hockey. And then as my interest in hockey got more and more, it just fully took over my entire personality. And then I just kept doing it. And it's become such a blessing for me the thing is, when you're talking to family, they're like, well, what do you do? What do you do for a living? And I'm like, I'm a YouTuber. And it's like, they'll think about like, oh, so you're like a Jake Paul or something. And it's like, no, I cover sports. I'm trying to be as serious as possible with this, but it is really funny how it's hard to explain, but it's just unbelievable to think that just a decision when I was 14 has paid off in so many ways.
And it's led you to Sportsnet now. So maybe you can walk us through how that came about.
Mm-hmm. So I was contacted last December, I believe, about being a part of the YouTube team and doing a bunch of content there, which was so funny because I was just chilling out in like a random, I think it was a Sunday afternoon, and I usually try to check my messages as much as I can, but I just randomly come across and the offer was there. And I usually go through my DMs, and sometimes it's people asking about like different trades that they're coming up with and just different hockey stuff. So that's what I was expecting to go through for like this afternoon.
You got offered a job in your DMs?
Yeah. it was the most interesting thing that's ever happened to me, because like I could have just missed it. And it was really funny to think about that. But it was just a random afternoon that I just remember getting that message and for like 5 minutes staring at it, not really like thinking that it was actually real. And then further going into it and being like, oh, this is real. This is real.
Checking to see if it was like a burner account, like you're going on. Like, what is this? Give me your social insurance number.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, hey, like this is, I absolutely love that. Like, I mean, obviously we're huge fans of you. We were really excited when you were willing to come on. I always feel like your views are fresh. You see things so well, and like it's impressive how much of a knowledge you can have of every single team. And like I say that because like I watch Ottawa, but I also like I follow, like Derek and I both follow prospects very closely. And you have like such a good grip on everything. And like that takes a lot of time and a lot of knowledge. And like for you to already be there pre being 20 and you're in this boat, like I can only imagine, like, first of all, you have to naturally be great at it, but you have to be just obsessed, and you clearly like, fit that bill. So and kind of on that note with your views on Ottawa and everything, like with that knowledge, tapping into it a bit, I was kind of curious if you could take us through your opinion of the Sens offseason. I know that you've been vocal a bit in talking about the top six being pretty legit. I don't know if it's better than Toronto's. There seems to be that debate that goes around quite a bit on Twitter. But yeah, like maybe if you could just kind of talk about like what you like, how you think they did this offseason, how much you think that it kind of moved them ahead, and like what do you think what do you think this group looks like now? Like how competitive are they kind of with these additions?
I mean, yeah, you put up a lot of great points. I'll say first things first. It's really interesting though how people sometimes don't even expect how much work goes behind the scenes. Like as much as I can do a lot more, but it's also keeping track with everything. And sometimes it is funny when I'll make a video or I'll be live streaming or something and I forget that like a random fourth liner got signed. But like usually for me, I'm usually on the nail with that stuff and I try to be as perfect as I can be. But it has positives and negatives because I like to be a perfectionist with knowing everything and trying to know as much as I can. But I mean, going to the Ottawa Senators, it was funny that you brought up the tweet about the top six, because I remember, because for some reason, I don't know how this happened, because I do follow as many Sens fans as I can. And I know a lot of good ones in the especially YouTube community that I've known for a while. But it's funny because I remember putting up that tweet about the Sens top six being underrated. And because at that point, I didn't really I heard quite a bit of buzz, of course, about the additions, but I didn't really see many people putting out that forward group as legit as it was. And it was funny because I set up that tweet and told and said that they were underrated, which I still think is the case in some ways. But it is funny that a lot of people that have seen the hype started to come after me in that way, especially some certain Leafs fans that apparently there's been a lot of discussions about with the comparisons. But I mean, honestly, with the Ottawa Senators, I honestly could not be happier with the direction they've gone in. I was a person that was really, really negative towards Eugene Melnick's time and how that, maybe not how that rebuild got started, but how it was transitioning from that 2017 Sens team, where that was the team that like Sens wide over these past couple of decades easily was my favorite to watch. And I've always been a huge Erik Karlsson fan during his time there. So that was a team that I loved. I just was rooting so hard to get to the cup final and get it done. But I just remember how the teardown happened and how it was all handled. And I just remember being so against it. But you see how Pierre Dorian has completely, and I'll be the first one to say, back in like 2018, even 2019 at points, I was not the biggest fan of what Dorian was doing. But you can see the seeds of what he's done, even back to the Erik Karlsson trade and getting Josh Norris in that, and a bunch of things that he's done. Building up that prospect group, but also getting the right people in place to develop those guys and change that franchise. And I think that's what I was really looking to see from the Sens back then in those years, and to see that turnaround happen. And I think it's happened a lot quicker than even I imagined it would, even if I did like Josh Norris a lot coming up and how he's done. And you of course have Tim Schlusa and all the players that they've built already, let alone the guys that are coming up now, like Jake Sanderson. But I gotta say, even though I feel like there is like a 50-50 chance to make the playoffs this year, I don't think it matters that much. I mean, as long as you are able to re-sign Alex DeBrincat, you're going to be set in almost every way in the future. And to me, this is a Sens team that will be, and I've said this even since like the offseason began with the acquisitions of Drew and DeBrincat, that they're going to be the team for me to watch this next year. But it continues to be the case where I have no team that I'm more interested in watching, hopefully taking that next step this next year. Even though the Atlantic is going to be tough, I feel like they're just going to be such a firecracker team, man. It's going to be so fun.
Hey, and before we get right into the Senators and DeBrincat, because I seen the live reaction video, I want to talk to you about that a little bit, because that was a cool one. But I know you're a fan of the Dallas Stars, so I thought, before we get right into the Senators, let's get your thoughts on the Jason Robertson contract and potential trade now. So what's going on? Like, what's the latest on that situation? Is it as ugly as it appears? Because I think the Stars are pretty cap pressed as well, right? They've got like just over $6 million left. So what's going on with that?
It's something that I remember talking about like as soon as 2 months ago. I remember talking with people, especially after they signed Mason Marchment to that $4.5 million deal, which I think is a great deal, but it also created a kind of cap dilemma for them. But I remember like a month ago putting out a tweet saying about how worried I was for that situation, and having tons of people saying, don't worry, it's going to get done in the next couple of weeks. Don't worry about it. And I remember thinking, I just have a feeling. I looked at their cap situation back then, and you obviously have it now. $6.3 million, which is, I think, like fourth most in the league. But considering the player of Jason Robertson's caliber, it's the only way they're able to sign Robertson right now is if they somehow convince Robertson to sign a 1 year, like literally 6.34, whatever they have left on the cap deal, which I don't see happening. And I think we've had a little bit of a quietness on details on Robertson, but we've had some things leak a little bit, mostly that he's just bent on getting a long-term deal as the number one priority, which we've seen a lot with a lot of younger players. I mean, Tim Stützle recently, of course, in the last couple of weeks, getting that longer-term deal. So you see Tage Thompson on top of that and other players, and Robertson wants to follow in those lines. But considering the Stars cap situation, they have no way of making that happen unless there were to be like an Anton Hudobin deal last minute or something. That's the only way I can see the Stars really getting out of it effectively and realistically. But I feel like it's one of those situations that I could see this being a William Nylander situation where this goes like a month into the season. And as much as it pains me to say that, I feel like it could be a situation where we do see actual legitimate trade offer or a trade and offer sheet interest. And we've already seen the reports about the Buffalo Sabres being inquiring about him and being in a potential deal, which they have the most cap space in the league at $20 million. They could easily make that happen, especially considering their prospect pool. But yeah, I've felt like it's been a dire situation for a lot longer than most Stars fans have. And I think we're kind of seeing, although I still think the offseason was pretty great for them, Robertson was still the number one priority easily. And now they've kind of locked themselves in a no-win situation, unfortunately.
Well, and that Otter contract, like I was actually kind of surprised that I think that this guy is like not far from being a top 5 goalie in the NHL. So I think it's going to happen like rather shortly. But yeah, I think that they're kind of banking on Robertson being willing to take a similar kind of contract. But at the end of the day, like I think he looks at Tim Stützle's deal and kind of is like look at his lips, thinking like, hey, like you've seen what I've actually put up. And with Timmy, a lot of it is like, we know that the potential's there and that's going to happen, but Robertson that has done it. And I think that's kind of the big advantage. And maybe we can kind of transition into that and to kind of get your thoughts on two of the big contracts that Ottawa locked up this year in their first and second line centers, presumably. I don't know what the play of Shane Pinto lately that might, but he might have something to say about that. But the long-term deals that Norris and Stützle signed, if you thought that they were pretty great deals on in terms of kind of market value and how you think that those will play out.
Yeah, it was interesting to, obviously with the Sens offseason, it was interesting to see how it wasn't just eventful with the acquisitions, but also how, I mean, that's one of the main things I was maybe not disgruntled with, because I could see why it happened, but also just sad to see with the kind of teardown we saw a few years ago, was that it felt like for the Sens, they weren't willing to really budge on giving guys that have deserved long-term contracts, even if some guys have not panned out, maybe like Erik Karlsson, for instance. But I think for the Sens to be able to to not just build this team in the way that they have and develop these guys like they have, like Tkachuk, like Norris, like Stützle, but to also be able to be bold and lock them up long term. I mean, that's something that I don't think we've seen as much with Ottawa's management and upper management in the past. And I think it's just a breath of fresh air, especially like with the Stützle deal, which has tons of risks, obviously. But at the same time, it's one of those deals where if it works out, that's the type of deal that you have on Stanley Cup winning teams. I mean, you see how the Avs bet on Nathan MacKinnon, for instance. At that point when they signed him, he wasn't this franchise face truly yet. He was in a position where he was playing okay, but he wasn't at his full potential. And the Avs knew that and signed him to that ridiculous deal that is still going to be in effect this next year. And I think even though it might not be as good with Stützle, we'll see if he's a top 3 center in the league. That's yet to be seen. I think it's one of those deals, same thing with Norris, where if it pans out, it truly pans out. I think the Stützle deal is a little more likely to be an amazing one, even if I love Norris to pieces. But at the same time, to get both of them locked up, I mean, Norris at 7.9. I mean, you can make the case that Norris is worth $7 million right now, and he's 23 as that younger center who can have such a great overall presence and that goal scoring edge. And to me, with Stützle, it's a much different game to him, but he's also a guy that I see panning out in a lot of ways with that deal. And of course, you lock up your captain and Brady Tkachuk, and there was, of course, the drama about that last year of it not getting done and getting it done right at the last moment, which I thought was such a key thing for the Sens. Even if, of course, they didn't make the playoffs this last year, it was such a key thing to lock up their true leader in the locker room. But I mean, you look at how many guys they've been able to do that with and get reasonably undervalued. I mean, Thomas Chabot was, I guess, the first one that really was the first drop in the bucket for that. I mean, $8 million as a long-term deal. When he's healthy, he's absolutely worth that. And I think it's just a great thing for the Sens to be able to consistently do this. And besides Tkachuk, not really have any lingering problems. And with Tkachuk, I think it made the most sense that it was kind of a stalemate considering his place in the franchise and how much he wanted. But I think it's a wonderful thing what the Sens have done. And I think it shows also Dorian's maturity and patience with the guys too, to be able to really put himself in this boat with these guys and maybe not as the greatest comparison, but kind of like Toronto, put themselves in this boat with these guys and really make sure these are the guys to lock up. And I think they've done that in a really good way over these last couple of off seasons.
So sorry, Derek.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Just on that note, because you give Josh Norris a lot of love, and obviously, like as Sens fans, we love to hear that because he is like such a natural goal scorer. He does so many things well. But one thing that like I'm curious of is you look at his shooting percentage last year, and it was among the highest in the league. Like he was scoring goals at what could be looked at as kind of like an unsustainable pace, as he was kind of like looking like he would be like a 40 goal scorer easily if he played a full season. And I'm curious, kind of in your mind, what you see his year to year at. Do you think that, especially with the addition of Alex DeBrincat, where now you have another pure goal scorer that's going to be on your power play? Maybe it's your power play 2. We saw that last night. It looked like a power play 1. So is that something that we think that pace could drop off a bit in your opinion? Or do you think that Josh Norris could easily be, not easily, but could be a 40 goal guy multiple times in his career?
Yeah, I think it's one of those interesting cases. I remember that streak that he started to go on during the season where it felt like every single week he was potting in goals left and right. And I do believe that there will be some deterioration in that shooting percentage. It was definitely, I guess, unsustainable. But at the same time, to me, what I think kind of stands out with Norris is that in a lot of different ways, especially with the growth curve that he's had. I mean, he's still 23 years old, and you look among the 23-year-olds out there, and to me, there's very few players out there that have had the confidence and the progression that he's had. And especially when you compare to his game maybe 3 years ago, I mean, this was a player that still had a lot of great traits to his game, but the refinement wasn't there. And I feel like his maturity has taken so many big steps to even where if he might not get 40 goals every single year, I still believe he'll be a pretty consistent player around that 30 goal threshold. And you combine the improving the overall game that he has and the IQ that he has. I mean, that's one of the biggest things I think helped Norris get those kind of unsustainable numbers, was that he was patient, but also his positioning was great. And he was a player that was able to work off teammates unbelievably well. And to me, I think alongside, of course, the chemistry that you have on that top six, I don't think he's going to be maybe that goal per game type of guy, maybe again, but I don't think that's also going to go against Norris too much. You see some of the advanced stats out there, and he's already a great underlying guy. And to me, I just see him being one of those smarter players in the Sens, continuing to really lead the way in a lot of key areas. And I mean, there might be a point as well where he maybe loses his first line center job to Stützle in maybe more offensive ways. We'll see if that ends up happening. But even if he's your second line center, considering how the cap could go up over these next few years, I think Norris could have a case to be worth that contract in maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And of course, you sign him to a long-term deal for a reason. And to me, I mean, I've always been a Norris fan, even going back to that Karlsson trade. I thought that was easily the most enticing piece going back to the Sens, and that's obviously been the case for them. But I guess Stützle was a part of that deal technically, right? So you get both, and you're pretty fine with that. But with Norris, I think it's going to be a really interesting year next year. That is true. That is true. I should be canceled for forgetting about Chris Tierney. That's my mistake. I'm sorry. I'm not perfect, as I said before. But yeah, I feel like it'll be fine. I feel like he'll be in a perfect position to just continue getting better in the little areas. And I mean, you have for the Sens, you already have such great dynamic, pure offensive guys like Stützle, namely, that I think if Norris needs to take a little bit of a step back in terms of his role, he can be in a defensive situation, can be more of a defensive second line center, and be perfect in that situation. I think that's kind of the great part about the Sens, is you have a lot of flexibility there, especially with the prospects coming up too. I mean, you'll have, if you continue with the core, you'll have potentially a center core of Stützle, Norris, Pinto, and Grieg, and it really doesn't get much better than that. And I think for the Sens, it's going to be one of their better traits going forward, really.
And while we're on the plethora of forwards that the Senators have, in your mind, does a 1A, 1B power play ever work? And can it work?
I mean, it is interesting, because I've seen, especially like the last year, we've seen a lot of power plays around the league change. Like I remember watching a lot of teams taking a lot more bigger steps with defensemen, and some teams even not even having a defenseman on their power play. But you see with the Sens, and I've heard a lot of the dilemmas out there with the Sens power play a little bit in the preseason, and how there might be some shuffling there. I mean, I think for the Sens, it's for me at least, it's a good problem to have. And personally, I'm not in a position where I can say, oh, I'd be a good coach in hockey, because I don't think I really would be. But at least when it comes to power play structure, I think, I mean, you see a lot of difference. For me, one power play that I really was kind of watching a lot last year was the New York Rangers, where they had their one power play where they had, I believe, Panarin, Zibanejad, Kreider, Strome, and Fox. And they played that power play unit for like a minute and 50 of the power play that they had. And that second unit where you were just where Lafreniere and Kakko were stuck, just having no ice time. It was really interesting to watch. I think for the most part, relying on the Stars and relying on that first power play unit, usually, at least in my experience, when I'm paying attention to it, at least, it is the best option. But I think for the Sens situation, with how many guys they could have on both power play units, I think it kind of makes sense, though, to kind of spread that out, make sure they get time to truly get chemistry with the advantage, with the man advantage there. And I think that also, it also helps that they have as much preseason time as they do to figure that out. But I think it also just goes to DJ Smith and his responsibility of knowing who to put where, because I don't really, it's a good problem to have, but I also don't envy him of how many options he has too. It's going to be an interesting power play to watch, especially in the first month, I think, of the year.
No doubt. And before we move on from the forwards, I did want to ask you about that reaction to Alex DeBrincat being acquired, because that was really, it was an epic sort of reaction. You just happened to be live at the time. It was a few hours before the draft that it actually took place. So can you walk us through what that reaction was like and how that reaction was from everybody in the comments section?
Oh yeah, it was one of the. I mean, that day was wild for me. I like to go a few hours before the draft because stuff like that usually ends up happening for some reason. Like, it's weird how some teams just don't want to make trades during the draft, but they'll do it like 4 hours before. Like they'll just tease us like that. So I like to be as live as I can during, especially day one of draft day. But I just remember when that deal was unveiled and seeing that DeBrincat went to Ottawa and realizing how good of a fit that was, because we already heard a little bit about the DeBrincat trade rumors and if he could potentially get dealt. It was at a point where it was starting to reach a little bit of a boiling point. But I also, at that point, I don't think we had Ottawa as like a number one destination. They were kind of still along the fringe. But I remember looking at that top six with DeBrincat added on top of them. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. For me, it felt like just so many riches for that Sens offense. Because I remember when that trade happened and thinking about my stars and being like, why didn't we trade a first, second, and third for why didn't every NHL team trade a first, second, and third for DeBrincat? And I think for the Sens, it also goes back to their boldness and how that front office has changed, willing to bring on guys like DeBrincat who aren't locked up for the future. They have that's one of the biggest things that I was most impressed about by the Sens was that they have done a complete 180 in their confidence to sign guys long term. I mean, you have DeBrincat who has 1 year left at 6.4. And even though he is an RFA, I think that speaks volumes towards Dorian's commitment to keep everybody here and to keep that core together and his confidence to keep guys in Ottawa. And I just couldn't believe it because for one, DeBrincat was always one of my favorite players in the Blackhawks. And as a Stars fan, the Blackhawks have been my least favorite team in the league for a very long time since I started being a hockey fan, which was coincidentally when they were one of the best teams in the league, which definitely fueled my hatred for them. So it's one of those situations where I'm like, as long as DeBrincat is not on Chicago or St. Louis or anybody like that, I'm great with it. But him going to the Sens was kind of one of those light bulb moments where I'm like, yeah, the Sens are going to be kind of awesome. Very soon.
So kind of on that note, I know that you said that it's a very underrated top six. I don't know if it's like top six or top nine. I think that there's a lot of guys who are kind of on that third line. I love Tyler Motte. Tyler Motte has like always been.
Yep.
I know, if he's Connor Bedard's favorite player, he's good enough to be my favorite player as well. So kind of one of those things where I've always been a massive fan of him. He just brings so much energy. He's so much fun to watch. Shane Pinto, I think Sens fans are looking at this preseason and they're like, my God, this like sky's the limit for this kid. Obviously, like didn't really play like any serious level of hockey until he was like 15, and it seems he's like another guy that his trajectory just is running off. And then you throw Matthew Joseph on there, who was he was like a point per game player after he came over in Tampa. Good. Like limited sample size, but he seems to fit in pretty well. So I'm curious, in your opinion, right now. So as of right now, obviously a lot of these guys are young and they're only going to continue to get better. Where would you rank Ottawa's top six or top nine kind of across the league?
I think it's one of those top nines. As you mentioned, I mean, I love the Tyler Motte signing. And I remember people chirping that he had no points in the playoffs. But if people actually watched the Rangers when Motte did play, he was such a perfect fourth line guy. And it was unbelievable to watch just how nothing happened when he was defending for the other team. He was brilliant positionally and played a perfect like playoff game and a game that could also, I mean, we all saw how last season with the Canucks, how solid he was in the regular season too, and how that play style really carried over. And as you mentioned with Shane Pinto, I was so mad when I heard of the injury last year because he was one of the guys that I thought could have been maybe not in contention for the Calder Trophy, but one of the more underrated guys for it last year. And now you look at his potential spot, how he's doing in preseason. And I'll be the first to admit, and this was probably one of my maybe not bigger prospect analysis L's, but I remember at the time when Pinto was drafted, I wasn't over the moon about it because at that point I didn't really see as much high end potential. And obviously, since he's pegged for a third line spot, we'll obviously see how far he goes. But his development with his tiny details in the game, with how he's able to process it, with how much faster he's gotten in his decision making, he's a guy that's just, as you mentioned, like that he's just gone on off a ramp of development. It's been just a huge progression over these past few years, and I could not be happier for him just watching him and how much his game has changed. And he's one of the he's become one of the most promising Sens players and prospects in the system. And of course with Mateo Joseph, who I don't think anybody really expected to be nearly as good as he was last year. And I don't think he'll be around that range, of course, with some limited ice time. But I do feel like in a third line role, he's perfect there. He's the type of guy that can bring some good sandpaper when he needs to. And alongside, I mean, if you have a third line of Motte, Pinto, or Joseph, if you go that route somehow, to me, that would be awesome. And you combine that with the top 6 they already have. And to me, I could see the argument that they're a top 15, top 9, maybe even top 10 in some key categories. But I also feel like, especially with the depth that they have, it's one of those situations where, although they might not be totally complete now, once you see Greg come up and once you see some of the other prospects too, I think this Sens forward group is going to be in a position where they have too many guys. Like in 3 years' time, they're going to have just unbelievable amount of depth. And I mean, there was the rumors that the Sens were acquiring about Chychrun and potentially trading Shane Pinto, and the Sens not wanting to do that. And I get it for sure, but it also speaks to the testament of their prospect depth, their forward depth, and just how many guys they have that are enticing to teams now. And I think that's an unbelievable progression from what we've what Sens fans have had to watch for the past 4 years now. And now you have, or I guess maybe last year was a much different story, but you see the progression of how much better that depth has become. And I think it's an unbelievable thing and makes that Atlantic division so much more interesting.
And while there's, all this hype and all kinds of positives about the offense, it's, transitioning to the defense, it's not quite the same story. You mentioned Jacob Chychrun, who's been talked about for, it almost draws parallels to Matt Duchene, like going back to when Ottawa acquired Matt Duchene. Like it just felt inevitable that Ottawa was going to acquire him, and it just took forever. I'm not so sure now at this point when, it seems like they can't make a deal work out, but at the same time, I wouldn't rule it out completely. Like I still think they're in those conversations. But without factoring in a top 4 defenseman addition immediately, at least in the season, where do you have this Sens D core, and are you concerned at all about their D heading into the season with young players like Jake Sanderson and Eric Brandstrom, who are kind of question marks at this stage in their career?
Exactly. I mean, I think it really all depends on that youth, because I'm huge. I'm pretty big on Chipot, huge on Artem Zub. He was a player that I remember in his first full season. I'm like, why is this guy I've never heard of a really weird name this good? And I remember just how much more reputation he got. But I absolutely agree, though, that to me, it's one of those defenses that to me kind of makes or breaks playoff hopes. But the thing is, for me, I look at, if they're completely healthy, I could see a situation where they're good enough to where that forward group, and I think an underrated tandem, could put them in the playoff spot. And I think it all comes back to the health of the defense. With Chabot specifically, if he plays a full season, it's unbelievable for that Sens defense, how much better it is. And of course, you got Zub onto that defense. But to me, I think it really all depends on how big of a step Eric Brandstrom takes. Will Jake Sanderson be in the Calder conversation? To me, Sanderson is the most underrated Calder nominee potentially. I mean, he's a guy that I think will get a lot of opportunity this next year. Has already looked pretty good in the spurts during the preseason in some games that we've seen. And to me, he's a guy that has already matured so much, has taken that offensive game in a much better way over these past couple years, and has improved it so much during his collegiate career. And to me, I see this Sens defense being one of the more interesting parts about the team, because I feel like the top six, even though there has been some question marks at some points, I feel like they're going to figure it out and be one of the best in the NHL. And that bottom six, I think, is going to be solid for them. I think that goaltending tandem, I mean, I'm pretty high on Cam Talbot and I'm pretty high on Anton Forsberg. I think he's really underrated, especially what we saw last year. But to me, I think it all depends on that defense, really, about how much success they have. But if Shabbat's healthy, if Sanderson takes that next step and Eric Brandstrom, I mean, it's funny to think about with Eric Brandstrom. He's 23. And he's a player that I think that some people have also given up on, and I can see why. But I also feel like if he's able to unlock his potential still and use this last year's, maybe this last chance for him with Ottawa, and really take that to heart, I could see him playing really well and really seizing that opportunity. Same thing with Jake Sanderson. And I think at his peak, it's still not going to be a good defense now, but I could see it still being an okay one and being good enough to where that goaltending can still be in a good position and that offense really carrying the load for them.
Well, and that's one thing I'm curious as well is I want to know, like you mentioned Calder and Sanderson in the same sentence. Mm-hmm. So obviously there's a lot of Sens fans that will be pretty happy about that, but I'm really curious to kind of understand what you see Sanderson's impact being this season. So coming in, we saw what Moritz Seider did. He walked on water last year in Detroit. And I think that it is unfair to compare anyone to what he did because he literally already looks like Victor Hedman. And I think but I do think that there are some Sens fans that are looking at that situation or other situations that were similar and thinking like, okay, like, could this guy step in and already be a second pairing defenseman? And if he is, what do you think he brings to the table? Because you also touched on his like how he's really like worked on even more so than his like transition play, his offensive play and what he's been able to develop and how far that's come since he's been drafted. Do you think when he gets to the NHL, like we see that on full display this year, or do we think that we see the Jake Sanderson that we kind of knew earlier where he plays a really, really sound defensive game and those offensive layers kind of start to come in year 2 and year 3 as he kind of like really masters his craft and gets comfortable at this next level?
That's a really good question for me because I feel like when it comes to Sanderson, he's going to be like, of course, I threw out the potential Calder nominee out there, but I also just think in terms of rookies, he's going to be easily one of the more interesting ones to watch. I remember last year going on Moritz Seider. I remember my Calder picks were I had a tie between Moritz Seider and Cole Caulfield, which when Cole Caulfield finally got a competent coach, he was looking like a potential Calder guy. But it's one of those situations where I remember looking at Seider last year and thinking with the opportunity he has, with how mature, and I think in some ways there are some parallels between Seider and Sanderson, where I remember in his draft year, I was relatively high on Seider compared to most. I think I had him 15th in my rankings, which I think at the consensus, he was more like a 20th guy. But I remember in his draft year, how for me, I loved his defensive game, loved his skating potential, but I also felt like there were some things limiting him offensively, some characteristics where he wasn't taking as many risks as I'd want to see. And it was kind of the same thing with Sanderson, the more I think about it, draft year wise and what we've seen him improve upon. To me, that risk-taking, that decision-making, the quickness that he has in the offensive zone has gone in such a way since his draft year. And to me, I could see maybe not as much of a successful rookie season, but kind of along the same lines where he finds success in a lot of different areas, is just a solid rookie. And I think solidifies potentially that second pair a little bit or wherever he may be placed. But to me, I could see a situation where he's up the lineup as quickly as possible. I remember that being a situation with Seider where he was, I'm pretty sure, on the third pair when he started out last year, and then almost immediately was on that first pair driving play and being as amazing as he was. And even though I don't see Sanderson being as good as Seider was in his rookie season, I can still see where a lot of the same improvements have come since both of their draft years, and how I think if Sanderson continues to take the risks, he'll have the skating and fundamental ability that he has on top of things to, I think, really drive success early. And I think the best is still yet to come from even after this year, of course, but I think he's going to be a solid rookie and be one of the more underrated guys and potentially be around maybe the 25, 30 points mark. And especially with the goal scoring, I think being a pretty underrated guy there too.
And while we're on the topic of rookies, being a Sens podcast, any chance we get to poke at the Toronto Maple Leafs or the Montreal Canadiens, we'll do it. I'm not sure if you've heard the recent comments from Kent Hughes of the Montreal Canadiens, the GM He used the term underwhelming to describe Uri Slafkovsky's camp thus far. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I remember when I saw that. I remember seeing that for the first time. I saw a tweet from the Score tweeting out the article they made about it and being like, "Wow, this is something." Because Ken Hughes has been relatively quiet so far as a GM. He hasn't really said too many things or been super public about his decision making. But it was interesting because for me, I remember the Uri Slafkovsky pick. I wasn't a pure Shane Wright guy, but I had Shane Wright and Logan Cooley almost tied as my 1-2, and then Slafkovsky third for me. And I remember at the draft, I'm like, okay, if the Habs are going to draft him, it's going to be more so because of positional need, NHL readiness, and the obviously the physical maturity he has. And it's interesting because even though I didn't have the biggest expectations for him in his rookie year, I considered him to likely get a spot with the Habs, likely be around 25, 30 points. And although not light the world on fire, still look okay at the NHL level to start. And you could see some of the NHL readiness there. But I also felt like there was a chance where he could be starting with Laval and the Habs take him as more of a project. But I also expected him to be a lot better in the preseason games that we have seen. I mean, it's one of those situations where I feel like he's kind of trying to get the notice of coaches by being as careful as possible, not trying to make too many mistakes, which I think is a mistake in its own self with Slafkovsky, because I feel like when he's at his best, he's a player that can drive play really well. And when he is taking risks, can do great things offensively, but he's also a player that can be really passive, can have periods where you just don't notice him at all. And I felt that inconsistency was a big problem, especially throughout the Liga games that we did see from him last year. And to me, I think Kent Hughes kind of said what we were all kind of thinking, is that Slafkovsky hasn't been what a lot of people expected. But I also feel like a lot of the Habs fan base set themselves up a little bit there, where they were expecting Slafkovsky to immediately be the best player, to be a savior for them a little bit. But I also felt, and I also had some reservations that would be the case to immediately start out. But I also did feel like Kent Hughes also expanded upon that, saying that they were drafting to get the best player long-term and not the best player in year one, which for me, and how I looked at things, I'm like, I would have taken Wright instead if you're putting that perspective on it. But I could see where the Habs are coming from with it. But it is interesting because I feel like Slafkovsky has already been so heavily scrutinized, and it's funny to watch because I remember when the lottery happened and the Habs got first overall and everyone was like, Shane Wright's coming to Montreal. I remember thinking, oh, okay, Shane Wright's going to get a lot of scrutiny, a lot of pressure. And now we've seen that with Slafkovsky already. And I feel like for the Habs, as long as they're totally patient with him, I feel like it will eventually be okay. To me, even if Jesperi Kotkaniemi was okay in his first year in the NHL, having him there just completely stunted his growth in so many ways. And to me, it is kind of crazy to think about, but I would personally have Slafkovsky in Laval on a top line power play, getting as much confidence as possible. And I feel like the Habs in not having their first overall pick in the NHL in year one have kind of been helped a little bit because the Sabres, of course, didn't sign Owen Power immediately, had him for another NCAA season. And to me, I think that was easily the best decision because he was a player that, although showed a lot in his draft year, improved so much, especially defensively in his second season in the NCAA, and now is looking to be one of the best rookies this next year. And I think that could still be the same way with Slafkovsky, where if you give him another year, I mean, the Habs aren't going to be contending for a playoff spot. It's not going to be a good year for them whatsoever. And if they don't rush him, I feel like he'll be okay eventually. I still don't think he'll be the best player in the draft, but I do feel like he'll be good enough. He'll be good enough.
Well, and typically guys of his size just take longer to develop. Like
exactly, that is true.
Like that is a fact. So I do agree with that. And you're kind of seeing more and more where the right development plan is not to rush these kids. It's to, like, they're 18 years old and give them the time. And it's becoming more and more common because the McDavids and the Matthews that can step in right away are falling
so rare
between. One kind of on that note, while we're talking about Montreal and talking about Toronto, one thing that Derek and I talk about a lot is kind of the inevitable shift in the Atlantic Division. Like we both think that it's probably not going to be this year, and it may not even be next year, but within the next 3 to 5 years, there's going to be a time where you're going to have Buffalo rising, you're going to have Detroit rising, you're going to have the Sens rising, hopefully, and you're going to have even Montreal likely is probably going to be on the rise, and then we're going to see the Tampas and the Floridas and Boston. I think we might already kind of be seeing it a bit, and Toronto, which I'm really looking forward to, kind of starting to tail off a bit. And there's going to be that flip. And I'm kind of curious from your perspective, when you think we might see that, if you, well, first of all, if you agree with what we're saying, and if you think that we're kind of close to some of those teams in the Atlantic not being as scary anymore, and all of a sudden Buffalo being terrifying. Because I personally am terrified of what's going to happen in Buffalo.
It is a good point, though. I think it's kind of not even just an Atlantic thing. I think it's an Eastern Conference thing where you've seen so many teams that have been dominant for the past decade. Tampa, I think, is inevitably going to start declining. Boston's going to inevitably start declining. And you're already starting to see it with teams like Washington and Pittsburgh a little bit. I think it's a kind of an Eastern Conference thing where we're just inevitably going to see some of these contending teams for so long start to dwindle. But I think in the Atlantic, it's the best example of that, where, I mean, I feel like this year is maybe the last year where we see Tampa as a top team, where we see Boston as a potential playoff team. Florida, the jury's still out. We'll see what happens. I think they'll kind of be a middling team in the Atlantic still for a while, mostly because of players like Spencer Knight coming up and Anton Lundell have been so good. So you got a little bit more youth there compared to other teams. But it is interesting because I kind of feel bad for teams like Ottawa and Buffalo that have to be in this Atlantic division. Because if it was the Pacific, I mean, Ottawa's making the playoffs. There's no question about it for me. But in the Atlantic, I think we're kind of we're going to be in a weird transition year where you still have teams like Tampa being playoff teams. But I think after this season, 2024 is where Ottawa will be a playoff team. Buffalo will be, I think Buffalo will be in next year in 2024 in Ottawa's position this year, where you're wanting to truly take that playoff push. It's a 50-50 shot, in my opinion, and we'll see what happens. But I feel like then Detroit, maybe the year after that, is going to be in the same position as Buffalo the year before. And we're going to see these teams transition as we've already seen them kind of get better over these past couple of years. But I absolutely agree. I do feel like, as much as I would rather see a team like Montreal or Ottawa be in a first position, I do feel like Toronto is still going to be good, at least if they keep Matthews. If they don't, obviously a different story. But I also feel like there's still going to be a playoff team, even if they might suck in the playoffs. I can't bet against the Leafs not making the playoffs. They're too good at making the playoffs and being horrible after that to not having the playoffs over the next 3 years, in my opinion, at least. But I do feel like, considering the Atlantic, I mean, you're going to have, I actually do feel like every single year you're going to have a new team really pushing for the playoffs. Ottawa this year, then Buffalo the next, then Detroit the next, or even Detroit still with Buffalo next year pushing for it. And then probably Montreal by 2025, 2026 will be taking that next step and truly getting out of the rebuild that they have right now. So I think it's going to be a really exciting era. A lot of new teams are going to be dominating the East really soon, which I love. I'm sick and tired of seeing teams like Washington be playoff teams, Pittsburgh be playoff teams. And I'm really glad that we're seeing teams like Ottawa and Buffalo and now Montreal building in the right way, in my opinion. And I think we'll see the fruits of the labor this next year and for the next decade and a half, really.
And last question from me. How good is Austin Matthews going to look in that Kachina jersey?
Oh, so good. So good. I mean, that's one of the things where I'm like, if Austin Matthews does go away from Toronto, I have a feeling it'll be LA that gets him. I like it, just considering they might not have the most cap in the world, but you could see maybe Anze Kopitar be retiring over the next 3 years potentially. If Austin Matthews wants to go somewhere, there's very few teams out there that have as good of a group as LA in the future. And I mean, as much as I would love to see Austin Matthews in Arizona, I'm not sure if he would love to go to that arena situation nor the team situation. But I mean, I'm all for player shakeups. I mean, obviously everybody media wise is helped by trades and movement, but seriously, I mean, for me, I've never been like, okay, I need to see NBA amount of trades. I just want to see a little bit more than what we have right now, especially in free agency. And even if we see Austin Matthews just test the waters, that's honestly all I want. Just give us a little bit of drama and get Arizona to offer something, and I'll be a happy man.
It's great as long as it's not Jason Robertson sitting around.
That is a great point. That's a great point.
Awesome. Well, Grav, we really appreciate you taking the time to come on, man.
Of course, this is amazing.
We love the Ottawa love. Again, like we're huge fans of your channel, so it meant a lot to be able to catch up with you. And yeah, hopefully we can connect again at some point in the future. Maybe when Ottawa is in the playoff push or something.
Oh
we
yeah,
can circle back and see just how spot on all of our takes.
That'd be perfect. I mean, when they're first in the Atlantic, we'll definitely be doing this.
2028,
2 months in.
I'm finding you. Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, again, and if anyone, is there anything that you want to promote? I mean, I think you're pretty well known. I don't know if there's anyone that's going to be listening to this that hasn't heard of you, but if you want to plug anything in here, I don't know if you've got like a sponsor for Manscaped or something you want to plug.
Yeah, thankfully no. But yeah, if you just want to check me out and get more thoughts on my thoughts on hockey, go to my channel Graviteh, or Graviteh, however you want to say it, which has an EH at the end if you want to really type it out. Also, of course, subscribe to the Sportsnet YouTube channel where I got a ton of stuff over there too. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun to talk about the Sens, man. I like, especially now, they're the team honestly one of the teams I love talking about the most. So it's been a blast.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.